I'm finally comfortable enough to tell this story, so here we go. 4 years ago, me, my deaf friend Lane, and my other friends, Leo and Jay, decided we would all go camping for the weekend. It was supposed to be perfect. For some context, me, Leo, and Jay are all pretty buff dudes, and Lane is a small, deaf, clumsy woman. Nevertheless, we were all friends. We got to the campsite and decided to camp at the site closest to the ranger station and bathrooms, as Lane didn't want to pee in the woods, and this was her first time camping. After we got our stuff set up, Lane needed to pee. We made Leo go with her, joking that she would get lost on the barely a mile hike to the bathrooms. After about 10 minutes, they came back with Lane looking confused. They both explained that while Leo went into the bathroom, this greasy, homeless-looking guy came up to Lane and started talking to her. As mentioned above, she's deaf and couldn't read his lips because of this dude's horrid beard. She described it as being ratty and so long it went past his belly button. So she just stared at him until Leo came back and they left. We were weirded out, and Jay and me went to check it out. We looked around for him, but eventually gave up. The rest of our day went by nicely, and by the time it was dark, we had all gone to the bathroom and hadn't saw the guy. Nevertheless, Lane needed to go again and forced me to come along with her. I did so to make her feel better, and while she went, I too decided to go again before I went to bed. This is where everything went wrong. While I was doing my business, I suddenly heard loud banging and yelling. I zipped up and ran outside. The yelling was coming from the woman's bathroom, and despite being a dude, I ran in to try and help. There I found the greasy dude from earlier. He was in fact greasy as hell, and looked like he had slept in dirt for months. He was on the floor on top of Lane, apparently trying to do you-know-what with her. He had a knife and had already cut her once. The yelling was coming from him, who she had already kicked and bit a couple of times. I grabbed him and knocked the knife away before grabbing Lane and running to the ranger station. Lane was obviously shook up, and the cut wasn't deep or bad and was fixed by the female ranger there. I was still mad and went to go find the son of a bitch with the male ranger and go inform Leo and Jay what had happened. We didn't find him, but Leo and Jay went to go see Lane, who was talking to some cops that had been called. We left the next morning, and about a month later, we were informed the guy had been found and caught trying to sexually assault another woman in a cabin at another campsite. Lane is still traumatized and hasn't even taken a walk since this event. None of us have gone camping since and don't really plan to. We already went to court and the guy's in prison, thankfully. I've shared this story here in hopes to help and warn others that anything can happen anywhere. Be careful and safe next time you go out. This story takes place in the early spring of 2016. I was living in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado and came home to spend a bit of time with my high school friends. One of our favorite things to do was camp together and hike, since we all had a heavy affinity for the outdoors. On this particular occasion, we decided to tent camp at a park on Lake Georgetown in Georgetown, Texas. It was a public campsite, but I guess because of the time of year, we were the only ones in the park. So with this, we picked a site very close to the water. We had a fun night, had a fire, drank some mead that my friend had made, used a hookah in the tent, and talked about random things we were up to now that we had graduated high school. We ended the night by the fire, drinking and eating some canned food. One by one, each of us left the fire and retired into the tent. Me and my best friend were the last ones in. Since we were right up on the water, we filled a bucket with lake water, separated the logs, and doused the fire. Then we both drunkenly meandered our way over to the tent. I've always had trouble sleeping. Even when I'm drinking, I tend to just linger in reality for a bit. So I just laid on my back and stared at the stars through the screen ceiling. I'm not sure when I did fall asleep hours later, but I do remember waking up to a bright orange light. At first, I thought maybe my friend went to grab something out of the truck and unlocking it triggered the parking lights. But this orange light got bigger and moved too much to be a stationary light. I slowly unzipped the tent flap and saw that the fire was going again. Now, this has happened to me before. If you don't douse a fire enough, it can still reignite with enough oxygen, or depending if something was thrown in there, it could burn for a while. But then I noticed that there were pieces of fabric and paper and this fire was going. I woke up my friends and they were all as creeped out as I was. That's when we saw at the edge of some brush, there was a guy in a red jacket and kind of balding hair. Think Mr. Noodle from Elmo's World, staring at us with a blank stare and an empty bottle in his hand. Made our blood run cold, but also, being dumb kids, we decided to run after him, but he had already started to head out before we made that decision and got away somehow. We left the next day and called whoever manages the park about the incident. We had checked the fire to see if anything was salvageable or identifiable, but unfortunately, everything was incinerated. They told us that Georgetown Police Department would do more rounds in the park, but that was about it. We quickly forgot about it because it was a pretty one-off experience, and the dude didn't hurt us directly. And of course, we all started going to college and shit, but still, pretty spooky. I grew up in a small town in western Massachusetts. It was a sleepy little community, and not much happened in the way of excitement. But this weekend we were going camping. It was Memorial Day weekend, and I just turned 11. We got to the campground and got set up. We mainly were by ourselves and only saw a few other families along the trail on our way to our campsite. It was peaceful, and after a long day of setting up and getting situated, I was ready to crash out in my tent. Help me, run, oh God, help me. I woke up like an alarm had gone off. I could hear this woman screaming at the top of her lungs. She came running into our campsite and was utterly hysterical with fear. My parents approached her to ask if she was hurt and offered her help, but she pushed past and kept running, all while screaming and sobbing. We followed her to the ranger station, as did a few other people from nearby campsites. She woke up the entire campground with her screaming. I remember the police showed up and all the flashing blue and red lights. 2 officers were standing around her as a paramedic wrapped her up in a blanket. She kept saying the same thing over and over again. She kept saying, "It was a werewolf. I saw it. It was a werewolf. Oh God, oh God." I remember the paramedics loading her up in the ambulance and driving it away. A few more cop cars showed up, and the police began searching through the woods. My dad told me to go back to my tent and go to sleep, and I don't know what else happened after that. Sometimes I still talk about that night with my parents. We all remember it. It still gives us goosebumps. I don't know what that girl saw in the woods that night. In the fall of 2019, I was going through a real rough patch. I was extremely depressed and in a very dark place at the time. So when my friend invited me to go to the Davy Crockett National Forrest with him to camp, I was more than happy to oblige. We decided we would camp at the Ratcliffe Lake campgrounds for 2 nights, and then the 3rd night we would stay at a free camping spot somewhere off of the miles of park roads scattered throughout the forest. So the first couple of days went by amazingly. I loved the smell of pines, especially in East Texas, and the campsite was beautiful, not to mention the lake. We did some kayaking and hiking, and the views really helped my mindset. It was awesome. However, on the 3rd morning, my friend got an emergency call and had to bail at the last second. I was slightly upset, but it didn't necessarily mean I had to go home just because he did. So I decided to stick to the original plan and find a place to camp deep within the forest. After he left, I headed to the nearest forest information center and snagged a map. The map showed the nearby highways in the forest. I scouted a couple of park roads and made my way towards them. After maybe 5 miles out of town, I found a park road which is indicated by a number sign and is only a dirt road. I head down it and settle in for the adventure. The road wasn't very narrow, but it would have been a hassle to move 2 trucks around each other, which I didn't really encounter. I kept the map on my lap and followed the road with my fingers while also checking the road ahead for potholes. The woods get super dense around me and darker, and it all kind of just enveloped my truck. I don't know how many miles I traveled before I first came to another turnoff, but it was clear that I was super deep in the woods. I traveled to where one group of campsites was supposed to be, which was a small loop. I turned down and, to my surprise, was met with a couple of trucks and RVs, all occupants outside cleaning guns or dressing deer. It was hunting season, so I guess it wasn't that big of a surprise, but it was still very off-putting with the looks I was receiving. So I made the loop and continued on. I drove a couple more miles and found another very remote spot at the corner of the woods. I pulled over and set up the tent and a fire and brought out the whiskey. I didn't have a great night and was burning some letters, so I got a little bit more depressed than I would have cared to be. So I ate some food, put out the fire, and headed into the tent to play the Switch and wind down. It didn't take me long to fall asleep, and I slept hard. I woke up around maybe 1 a.m. to the sound of footsteps circling my campsite. I'm a pretty avid camper, so I just assumed it was a critter checking out the human who decided to chill in his pad without asking. I started to drift off again when I heard a low cough. Instantly, I was awake. I just kind of laid there, listening, and the footsteps approached my truck. I had locked my truck, but heard the obvious signs of someone trying the handle, then quietly shuffle over to the other side and try the other handle. I had a spotlight that I brought with me, so I quietly unzipped the tent and pointed my light in the direction of the noise and shouted out. I caught a brief glimpse of whoever it was in all camo everything, sprint off into the woods with no light. Like they took off, and although I had no plans on following them, I scanned the brush with my light and couldn't see anything. I turned off my light to see if I could see a phone light or flashlight, but instead, I heard very loud crashing into the brush that just got quieter and further away. So whoever this person was ran into the dark woods with no lights and all camo. Considering the map, the direction he ran also didn't have any more roads nor amenities. So maybe he was on private property, I don't know. But I was very scared. I just collapsed my tent, forget about putting it in the bag, shoved it in my back seat, and drove the park roads like a bat out of hell. Once I got back to the main road, I drove 4 hours back to my hometown. I want to go back sometime, but with friends and maybe a gun. But yeah, that was not a fun experience, and definitely up there as one of the most frightening things that has ever happened to me in the woods. So in 2015-2016, I didn't know what I wanted to do after high school and joined a gap year program in the Colorado Rockies, specifically at Snow Mountain Ranch in Granby, Colorado. It's part of the YMCA of the Rockies. It was an awesome gig because although I worked, the room and board was paid for, and I spent a lot of time hiking, canoeing, and adventuring out of the resort with the friends I made to different towns in the area. Honestly, one of my all-time favorite memories. I had some creepy experiences in the woods, like coming across small herds of moose at night. Moose are freaking huge. Hearing coyotes in the distance, feelings of being watched. But overall, it was nature, and although creepy, wasn't anything David Attenborough hasn't seen. The only unexplainable and creepy experience I had that was experienced by more than one person was when we hiked, but mainly drove, some old logging roads to an abandoned yurt in the middle of the forest. It was Halloween of 2015, and there was a staff party. It was fun, and I went as Gumby in a full costume, but since it's a YMCA-sanctioned event, no alcohol. So we decided to ditch the party, and 7 of us crammed into my friend's Jeep Cherokee to go make a party of our own. It had snowed, and my friend, who I'll call Abby, knew about an abandoned yurt because one of our fellow staff would go out there and drink by himself, which I thought was pretty weird. But we were all gung-ho and tired of the Safeway snacks and drinks at the party, so decided to go for it. The snow started to pick up a bit more as we went out there, but since Abby had a decent off-road vehicle, we managed. Now a bit more context on the yurt and the property. Like maybe a decade prior, there was a pine beetle infestation that killed a lot of trees, so they had to cut down a lot of the forest. When I got there, they were in the middle of replanting, so logging had since ceased. So there were miles of old logging roads just abandoned, but the YMCA turned them into Nordic ski trails for the winter. So the yurt was out there for people who wanted to get out of the elements if they needed. At least that's what I was told. I knew we didn't let customers rent it because I worked at the front desk. Anyway, we drove out there drinking whiskey and blasting some Halloween soundtrack that helped make the ambience a bit spookier. Although it had been snowing a bit, there wasn't enough on the road yet to cause an issue. After a 30-minute drive into the woods, we pulled off to the side where there was a locked gate, so obviously we jumped it. We had brought pillows and blankets with us because we planned on staying the night. We had to walk another 15 minutes to get to it. It was in a really cool spot, like in a clearing and at the bottom of a cliff. It was miles into the woods and away from the main property. Time to get messed up. We drank and smoked for a good while and had a lot of fun. We made snow angels and had a snowball fight. We went back into the yurt after a while and continued our consumption and started telling scary stories. After a while, we started getting sleepy. We got in whatever sleeping bags or blankets we brought and tucked ourselves in. Made a couple of jokes as we fell asleep to break the silence, but after a bit, we were knocked out. I woke up early to Abby's boyfriend shaking me awake and pointed to the window. There was a shadow there. All of a sudden, we heard loud banging like something had thrown itself into the side of the yurt. Everyone was up now. The sound of something smacking against the canvas sides started coming from all around. At first, I thought it was snow falling off the treetops, but we were in a large clearing with no trees over the yurt. Then we heard the sounds of something climbing up the 3 wooden steps and pausing. We all held our breath. Nothing. Not one sound. Abby was the only girl, and all of us dudes decided to rush the door and see what was out there. We opened the door to nothing. It was quiet as hell. The worst part was what we found outside the yurt, which was the lack of footprints. No paw prints, no boot prints, not even snowshoe tracks. The snow had even blanketed over the footprints we had left earlier. We thought maybe the wind had lifted the canvas and made it flutter, but when we checked it, it was flush with whatever it was attached to and couldn't move it. It was super weird. We thought maybe the staff member who came out to drink by himself was behind it, but there were no boot prints. I also don't think it was the wind, because me and Abby's boyfriend saw the shadow by the window, and we all heard the footsteps out on the porch. We were pretty sober at this point and wanted to go back, so we left. Never went back to that yurt, but can't say I want to anymore. When I was in my early 20s, I loved to be outdoors. Every weekend I would either be out hiking, camping, or fishing. No questions about it, even in the winter. I remember this one time in 2010, when I was 23. I'd gone out with a friend to go camping over Memorial Day weekend in the Smoky Mountains. We hiked into the backcountry about 6 miles and set up camp. Then we went and did a bit of fishing. Nothing remarkable happened during the day, and it was a great time. In the evening, we ate dinner and relaxed around the fire. Now, where we were was off trail and far away from other people. It was also densely surrounded by trees. So when the sun went down and we heard things walking around in the dark, we figured it was the wildlife out there. After the fire was doused, we went into the tent. It wasn't long after that we started to hear more rustling out in the trees. If someone was trying to sneak up on us, they were doing a terrible job, and it started to sound like more movement than wildlife would make. Twigs would snap and bush leaves rustled. Our first thought was, shit, a bear's coming, because it sounded like it was lumbering like a bear would. We had hung up our food and put them all in airtight containers. Still, maybe it was coming to investigate what we were up to. I grabbed my little Winchester repeating rifle I take with me into the back country. Chambered in .357 Magnum, it'll stop anything out there I might need to stop, and it's not too bad to sling to my pack. Anyways, after I grabbed the gun, my buddy cut off the lights so we didn't silhouette against the tent. If it was a bear, the light wouldn't matter since it already had a scent. As soon as he cut the lights off, the sounds outside stopped. Kinda like whatever was out there knew that we knew it was there. For the next few minutes, the only sound I heard was my own heart beating. After what felt like an eternity, we heard the rustling start again, only this time you could tell they were trying not to be heard. We knew then it was definitely not a bear. The night was pitch black, especially under the canopy of trees we had camped under that blocked out all the light from the stars above. I jumped when my buddy tapped me on the shoulder. He leaned in real close and whispered in my ear asking what we should do. I didn't know. The sounds were getting closer, and I wasn't sure if we should run or stay hunkered down. I didn't like not being able to see what was out there. Finally, I decided we should take a look. If it was a bear, a blast from my gun should scare it off. My buddy fumbled around in the dark for a flashlight, grabbed it, and we went outside. My buddy turned on his light and started looking around. There was rustling in a bush about 20 feet away, just at the edge of the light. I hollered out that if someone was there, they need to show themselves before they got blasted. Something responded, but it wasn't a growl and it wasn't speech. It was a low mixture of both, and we couldn't make out what it was. Maybe it was some drunk kid who was stumbling around in the woods or something. You never know, so I wasn't comfortable at blindly shooting into a bush. We took a few steps closer, and whatever it was retreated a ways back. We could tell because bushes further back started to rustle. It seemed to be keeping a distance just outside of our light from us. We got the feeling that it wasn't going to attack us straight on, so we walked forwards with more courage. It must have been trying to flank us because soon the sounds were coming from beside us instead of in front. We were sure it was still only one out there because we never heard more than one moving at a time, but it had gotten around us pretty quickly and in silence. I fired a warning shot up into the trees to see if I could flush whatever it was out or scare it off. We heard nothing for a few minutes. It must have been thinking on if it wanted to tangle with us, because after that few minutes, we heard it much further off into the woods like it was leaving the area. My buddy and I slept in turns that night, always weary that the thing might return, but it never did. The next day we went out to look for prints in the daylight. With all the trees around, the ground stays soft, but we didn't find any prints. The only evidence we found were broken twigs on bushes in the ground. I've never had that feeling out in the woods before. It felt like we were being hunted. I don't know what it was that was out there. It sure didn't act like a bear, and it didn't sound like a human when it responded to us. We never saw it, and there were no prints. It really gives me the shivers to think about. When I was younger, my dad owned one of those camper vans. It was kind of his thing to take the family out to small towns and explore them. Then, after we were done, we would travel down a back road or some dirt trails and spend the night. Not sure if it was exactly legal or safe, but it's what we would do. I remember one time he took us about 6 hours from our hometown one weekend to this cool little town. It had a boardwalk, some antique shops, and a really nice playground. We spent the day browsing and shopping, had dinner in a neat retro diner, and then headed out to one of the back roads to sleep for the night before we went home the next day. It must have been around 1 or 2 in the morning, and this was years ago, so I don't remember exactly, but we were woken up to the van rocking. I asked what was going on, and my dad groggily responded that it was the wind knocking the van around. I didn't hear any wind, but I didn't know any better and tried to get back to sleep. A few minutes later, the van was knocked so hard that I swear it came up from its tires on one side. This woke my dad up and he jumped up cursing and spitting. My mom was freaking out too. The van was knocked hard again, then again. My little sister was crying, and I was so scared I couldn't speak. There was pounding on the sides of the van and all sorts of noise. It sounded like multiple people punching the metal. My dad ran to the front and started the engine. With the headlights on, he could see there was nothing in front of him. He peeled out of there as fast as he could, and we never looked back. We don't know what happened that night. Maybe some kind of earthquake or something. But where we live, those almost never happen. There was nothing in the news about any quake either. Like I said before, we couldn't hear any wind, so we don't think it was that. There were no marks on the van either. The paint wasn't scratched or anything. We still talk about it nowadays as some kind of unexplained event that happened, and no one has any idea of what it was.